For the last few entries, I've been giving examples of Mathew Franklin Whittier's code. And by code, I mean not cryptography, but his method of imparting secret information in his written works. I've got one more example I'd like to give. It doesn't have to do with any of the famous authors or famous claims. And it's a real short one, except that the backstory is huge. It's very deep. I could spend all day talking about this and substantiating different things because one thing depends on another, which depends on another. And I would have to go very deeply into it, which I'm not going to do, but I have to give a little of the background. This appears in The Carpetbag. This is a humorous family magazine edited by Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, the creator of the Mrs. Partington character. This newspaper ran from 1851 to 1853. Mathew was a silent financial partner. He was personal friends with Shillaber, and he collaborated with him over the years, so they were fairly close, except that Shillaber was kind of a mild conservative. But he drew conservatives around him, see, and here was Mathew, this ultra liberal. And so Mathew had to kind of disguise his liberality, his radical leanings, in such a way that he could get his stuff published in this newspaper. I really think that a lot of things that he submitted, Shillaber didn't even know he was the author, and he also had to get his radicalism past Shillaber, see? So there was some very strange things going on in this paper. There was a lot of political jockeying amongst the contributors and a lot of politics in it, which Mathew alludes to, which I won't go into here. But he created a couple characters which became quite popular nationally, as I understand. One of them was a caricature of a military hero named Ensign Jehiel Stebbings. Now, this one and another one, Dr. E. Gertie Digg, were attributed by Shillaber in his memoirs in later years to a career academician named Benjamin Drew. I don't know whether Shillaber did this because he literally didn't know that Mathew was contributing and originating this material, because he didn't know who was contributing. You know, you can see this in the To Correspondence section, that Shillaber didn't know who some of these people were. I mean, he knew the people, but he didn't know that they were contributing the articles because everything was done under pseudonyms. So he may literally have thought that it was Benjamin Drew's, and apparently Benjamin Drew started claiming some of it. See, this is what happened with Mathew's work. He would write this stuff anonymously, and his best work would get famous, and rumors would be flying, and sooner or later somebody would step in and modestly admit, oh yes, that was me, see. That happened with Margaret Fuller and apparently a number of other people. Ashen Dodge and quite a few others I could name. So apparently that happened with Benjamin Drew. Or the alternative explanation is that Mathew requested from all of his editors that he never be mentioned, that he always be kept anonymous. And so his editors would handle this in different ways. Joseph T. Buckingham kind of worked around it and made a reference, you know, but he kind of put Mathew's name in code and so on. Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber may have just flat out lied about Mathew's authorship, see? So we don't really know how it came about that Shillaber attributed this work to Benjamin Drew, but through a researcher, I got into Benjamin Drew's private papers and looked at his unpublished autobiography and his diary. And although a couple of the poems, which are part of this series, appear in his diary, which he claims, I think it's a lie. I don't believe that he actually wrote this stuff, because everything else in his diary, including the complete lack of any mention of the carpetbag whatsoever, suggests that he was not the real author of this series. All of this started, this particular series that includes Jehiel Stebbings, started with a pseudonym, Trismegistus. Now, if you've watched my last 2 or 3 entries, you'll know that Mathew used Trismegistus very early as 1828 and then again in 1835. It has to do with the tutoring that Abby was giving him regarding esoteric subjects and other subjects. There's a deep backstory with this pseudonym with Mathew. There's no backstory or reason in the world why Benjamin Drew would have ever used this pseudonym. So it's pretty clear that all this work is Mathew's. Now, Mathew was raised Quaker. He was anti-war in general, but he was ambivalent on this topic because he was not in favor of cowardice, and he was in favor of use of the military for truly noble purposes. What he was not in favor of was materialism and the bloodlust and the great glory of war for its own sake, like it's a sport, like it's football, in other words. He was very much against that. So he created this character, Ensign Stebbings, as a war hero, and it looked straight. He played it so straight that I'm sure there were a lot of people that took this literally and seriously, and that was intentional. He was basically suckering people in, and then he would deliver the coup de grace, with some stupid thing about how he survived the Alamo, which nobody survived the Alamo, so it was obvious bullshit, but everything else would look straight. See, that's in one of his poems. So here we have a coded message. And it's in two parts. The first one is in November 29, 1851 edition, and then the second one is in the January 5, 1852 edition. And we have it here. This is the carpet bag. I will show you bits on the screen here. There we go. I think you can see it, volume 1. And the first one is about the old Stebbings mansion. Now, there's a picture of the mansion here. And what we know is that Mathew loved to create these fall biographies. He did one for Mrs. Partington and the Partington Mansion. He did a much earlier biography, pseudo-biography about Dr. Dotimus Duckworth back, I think it was 1834, 33 or 34. That is mistakenly attributed to Mathew's former editor, Asa Green. It was not Asa Green, that was Mathew. So he loved to create these pretend biographies, okay? So he's done the same for Stebbings because he did the same for E. Gertie Digg, the other character under this Trismegistus umbrella. So he wanted to establish his character as a real person, and the way he did it was to write about the old Stebbings mansion. And let's see, I could just start it out here. The house which spread its sheltering rafters over the head of the infant Shakespeare, and beneath whose roof nature first unveiled to him her awful form, is yet extant, and is yearly visited with deep and heartfelt emotions by thousands of Englishmen, Yankees, and Hungarians. The old house in Cambridge, where Washington established his headquarters during the investment of Boston, when his troops had but 9 rounds of powder apiece, is yet pointed out by intelligent omnibus drivers to the admiring visitors of Mount Auburn and Fresh Pond. And the house of the elder Stebbings, which first shielded from obnoxious atmospheric influences the juvenile Jehiel, yet adorns the village of Spunkville. Well, Mathew created this town, Spunkville, that Jehiel Stebbings was from. Now, he goes on like that. That's typical of Mathew's prose, by the way. If anybody's into style analysis, that's just absolutely typical. Now, down here, we talk about the big oak table is nearly covered with recipes, of which the following may serve as a specimen. And it's written in Old English, but it's fake Old English. So, how to make ye goodly donuts. Well, look at the word to. It's spelled T-O-E. And that was one of Mathew's favorite misspellings. He used it in Ethan Spike a great many times. I'll put up on the screen how many, and in other pieces as well, but it's kind of hard to look up. You have to look at each individual instance to make sure it wasn't some other spelling of something. So rather than just count the hits that I get, I have to go into them and look. So we'll just stick with Ethan Spike and the number that it is in Ethan Spike. But that was one of his typical misspellings, so we know that Mathew was the author. But now underneath this it says, the hall is adorned by an old print of the Battle of Blenheim. Often did his wondering mother find Jehiel standing in silent admiration before that work of art, contemplating the fray, with those emotions which are peculiar to the soul of the enthusiastic soldier. That print did much to form the character of our presidential nominee. The bold, adventurous face of Marlborough and the sharper features of Prince Eugene both lent their influence in shaping and modifying the physiognomy of the future ensign. Now, I've said that Matthew would say something, a statement that looks superficially as though it's in praise, but really it's neutral. And being neutral, it's actually disparaging, okay? So we've got that here. Standing in silent admiration, so we know he admires it, before that work of art, contemplating the fray with those emotions which are peculiar to the soul of the enthusiastic soldier. That's not favorable. Matthew has no respect at all for enthusiastic soldiers who are in it for the fun of it, see, or the glory of it. So those emotions which are peculiar to the soul of the enthusiastic soldier. But what is the Battle of Blenheim? Okay, I looked this up. And once I got into Wikipedia, I saw something extremely interesting. And it reads, lacking in numbers, Prince Eugene could not seriously disrupt Talliard's, I guess it's pronounced Talliard's, march, but the French marshal's progress was proving slow. Talliard's force had suffered considerably more than Marlborough's troops on their march. Many of his cavalry horses were suffering from glanders, and the mountain passes were proving tough for the 2,000 wagon loads of provisions. Okay, so far so good. Now check this out. Local German peasants, angry at French plundering, compounded Talliard's problems, leading Merode Westerlo to bemoan, quote, the enraged peasantry killed several thousand of our men before the army was clear of the Black Forest. Gives a reference, David G. Chandler, 2003, Marlborough as military commander, etc. Well, Matthew knows that plundering also means rape, and he's very, very strongly against rape in battle and war, okay? So that's what he's referring to. He's got his military caricature admiring the Battle of Blenheim and forming his young character based on the admiration of this painting. But really, Matthew is saying that he's a total degenerate because he's admiring a battle in which there was plundering and rape. See? That's Matthew's secret message. Well, let's move on. There's a couple other references. Here's another one in another website. I think it's another website. After the battle, the French fled, quote, through the tangled passes of the Black Forest, while the Allied army, frustrated and trying to force the Elector of Bavaria to quit the war, started plundering the local settlements. Faulkner, using a historical source, well, we've lost the source, but anyway, says that, quote, for miles, Bavarian hamlets and villages were put to the torch after cattle and crops were seized. With fire and sword, the country round was wasted far and wide, and many a nursing mother then and suckling baby died. So they're slaughtering women and their infants. Yeah, you understand? This is what Matthew was doing with his military caricature. There's another quote here. This is someone who was there, it's a first-hand account, was Christian Davies, a woman who disguised herself as a man in order to enlist and stay with her soldier husband. That sounds kind of admirable, but now listen to this. She described the, quote, collateral damage of Marlborough's scorched earth campaign thus. The Allies sent parties on every hand to ravage the country, who pillaged above 50 villages, burnt the houses of peasants and gentlemen, and forced the inhabitants with what few cattle had escaped the insatiable enemy to seek refuge in the woods. We, speaking firsthand, miserably plundered the poor inhabitants of this electorate. I had left the hospital time enough to contribute to their misery and to have a share in the plunder. We spared nothing, killing, burning, or otherwise destroying whatever we could not carry off. Well, presumably the only thing she didn't do was rape. Well, anyway, that's Matthew's code. Because if you didn't know, and I didn't know, initially I had to look it up. If you didn't know the history of the Battle of Blenheim, you would swear that this wonderful admirable person as a boy is forming his sterling character by studying this battle scene, which was prominently displayed in his home. And then the final touch of this thing is that in the January edition, January 5th, 1852 edition, he brings this to his new home. This is a letter from Spunkville. And in the letter, it mentions that he brings this thing to his home. Now, what's interesting is that he is meeting, this is an account of him meeting Lajos Kossuth, the Hungarian freedom fighter and statesman whom Mathew deeply admired, because he really was a man of character fighting for a noble cause. But he has Ensign Stebbings meeting with this guy. And this is an expression of Mathew's strong ambivalence on this topic. He struggles and struggles and struggles with this. Here he says, my four-room has been newly papered. He's talking to Kossuth. My four-room has been newly papered, and I have borrowed from the old mansion the print of the Battle of Blenheim. It hangs over the mantel tree. Actually, she's talking about Kossuth. Kossuth will like that, for Englishmen fought triumphantly at Hockstad. This is signed Trismegistus. This one is actually signed as Trismegistus. So sometimes, in a sense, this is a spin-off from Trismegistus, but occasionally it's actually signed with that pseudonym. Now, other writers joined in the fray, with this, but where it's signed Trismegistus, that's Mathew. So that just gives you one more example. There are many others, but the ones, my favorite ones, where he quotes a piece of poetry and then you look it up and you find the real message above or below, that really, as far as I can figure out, only occurs where he deals with these major plagiarists. And I didn't really want to bring in them because, again, I'll be scooping my own papers that way. It comes in big time with Edgar Allan Poe, and it comes in big time with Margaret Fuller. There's an instance in both of those. So here I am at 18 minutes, and that's as long as I want to make this. I just wanted to give you one more example. I notice once again that where I talk about Mathew and his legacy and unearthing work from his legacy, that I get 4 or 5 hits. And where I talk about where Mathew's legacy impinges on these famous people like Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe, I get more like 15. And presumably those extra 10 or 11 people are on the defensive, and trying to disprove what I'm saying. Because if they weren't on the defensive, they would be interested in Mathew, who was the real author of The Raven and the real co-author of A Christmas Carol. They would start to get interested in Mathew and Abby instead of only being interested when I talk about Dickens and Poe, which again means they're in defensive mode, Well, you have to read my books in order to really see my evidence, because Mathew Franklin Whittier is so deeply hidden that it's very difficult to find smoking guns. I found a few. There's 1 or 2 in my article about A Christmas Carol. If anybody would read it with an open mind, there are smoking guns in there. But this is not kind of a smoking gun case. It's not a case that lends itself to that. It's a case that is only really revealed when you look at all the information, when you really, delve into it in depth and see. Again, as I've said, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. You've got to get the whole picture. The whole picture, the first book is 2,280 pages. And the second book is about 700 pages. And there's very little interpretation in there, some, but basically it's evidence, because for 11 years I kept finding new evidence, and it's all in there in the order basically that I discovered it. And if there's an interpretation and it's wrong, I left it in and put in parentheses what I discovered later. That's completely transparent, total transparent track record. You won't be able to refute my work logically unless you read all of that with an open mind. Then you can have an opinion. This business of glancing at one paper and deciding that it's drivel, is totally irrational. You can't evaluate this that way. Because, I don't have a signed document from Mathew Franklin Whittier which says I was the real co-author of A Christmas Carol, and I was the real author of The Raven, and 90% of the work that's claimed for Margaret Fuller was really mine, and 4 of the poems that Elizabeth Barrett Browning published, was really my work. I don't have that, and I don't have signed confessionals from Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe and the others. So if that's the kind of evidence you want, I don't have that, and of course I wouldn't have that. If a diary ever shows up someday, and Matthew did keep a diary because he mentions it, if that ever shows up, it could corroborate a lot of these things, but it hasn't shown up. It likely will never show up unless my work becomes famous to the point where it's like a household name, and then somebody will stumble across it in an attic and go public. See, up until then, we'll never know. So with somebody this deeply hidden, you've got to have tons and tons of evidence, which is all interconnected, and you've got to see the pattern, and then there'll be a few bright spots, a few smoking guns, little puffs of smoke coming up here and there in this vast landscape. That's the kind of evidence I have. It's very strong. It's cumulative evidence, and it's huge because, like I said, I've got, this vast amount of evidence. I've got 2,300 of Matthew's published works digitized, plus there's books, but it's all hidden under these pseudonyms, and a great deal of the best of the work has been claimed for or by other authors, some of them obscure, some of them famous. You can't get a quick opinion on this by glancing at a couple papers. Now, is it worth all that trouble? Well, if he really was the original co-author of A Christmas Carol and the original author of The Raven, just there, I think it's worth it. Don't you? But you won't be able to dismiss this without studying the entire thing. That's what I'm telling you. Rationally and logically, you cannot say that you've, just dismissed this because you read half of one paper. Fooling yourself if you think you can do that. All right, that's enough. If you've watched this, thanks for watching, and we'll see what I come up with next.